Welcome to Reason Workshop, Class 20. Today we're going to go over the Thor Polysonic Synthesizer. We'll start out and do a tour of Thor, then we'll go through the controller, then the programmer, then the modulation bus, then the step sequencer, then routing audio through the Thor. Okay, let's start out with a tour of Thor and go through the different sections. This is called the controller, the whole front panel. If you hit Show Programmer, then it flips open to reveal the programmer down here, and within there are different slots, 3 different oscillators, filters, LFOs, global controls, mod envelopes, filter envelopes, etc. By clicking on the arrows, you can choose between the different kinds of oscillators and filters. Down below is the modulation bus, where you can assign a certain parameter to control another parameter in varying amounts. At the very bottom is the step sequencer, which you can run similar to a matrix or redrum device, and you can have a step pattern through various curves. Even though it seems as though there's just 16 knobs, you can assign them to these 6 different settings to allow you a total of 96 different knob twists that can make your Thor patch twist and turn into all kinds of tones. On the back of the Thor, you have a variety of different routing possibilities. Sequencer control inputs, pitch bend and mod wheel inputs of CV, modulation inputs, CV inputs and outputs. Then you also have 4 audio inputs and then 4 audio outputs. You also have varying step sequencer CV inputs and outputs on the very bottom. Most of that is configurable through the bottom of the modulation matrix. So we'll start out with the controller. The standard thing that most of you guys are going to do is just browse patch. So you hit browse patch, you can go into the library, and within this library you have a plethora of different sounds: bass, effects, lead synths, pads, percussion, polysynth, rhythmic, and sequence tones, as well as artist presets. On the very far left, you have the pitch bend wheel, and you can set how far you want it to go. 1/2 step all the way up to 24. And then you also have the mod wheel, and in certain patches you can hear that has a drastic kind of effect. Mod wheel is something that you assign. Now for keyboard modes. So this has to do with how many notes you can play at one time. So mono legato means that you can only play 1 note at a time. If I had it on polyphonic, I could hold down 4 notes at the same time. Let me show you the difference between those 2 modes by altering the attack down here. So on mono legato, you can hear that swell is just on the first attack. But if I put it on re-trigger, that swell happens on every note. The release polyphony has to do with how the individual voices are released. Now, portamento, you turn it on here, this toggle switch, to allow you to glide between notes. So if I play really low to high, you can hear that slide. And the portamento knob has to do with the amount of time it takes to get from one note to the next. Now the trigger section will either set Thor to be triggered with MIDI or with the step sequencer. Meaning that if I turn off MIDI, I can still hit the keyboard, but it doesn't do anything. I can also just use the step sequencer, which we'll go over later. And finally, these different knobs and buttons are called modifiers, and they can be assigned to anything that you want. All of that would be controlled down here in the modulation bus. You just click on modifiers. So here we're going to assign the frequency. And if you build a patch from scratch, you can double click on that title and type whatever you want in. And as you can see that, this button turns on the shaper as shown down here on the modulation bus. And finally, on the very far right of the controller, you have the master volume. So now to the programmer. Again, if you're going to open it, you just hit Show Programmer, and that pops it open. Let's now go to Initialize Patch, which is in the Edit menu. And it starts out with just one oscillator and one filter. So let's go over the oscillator section now. So if I just click on the triangle, it'll show you that you have analog oscillator here. You can select through several different wave shapes, and the octave is similar to like what we went through on a subtractor. Next, wavetable oscillator, which is kind of like the grain table synth, somewhat of Maelstrom. There's a variety of different specific tones in here. After that, you have a phase modulation oscillator, and that also has a bunch of different wave types in it. And you can put them in or out of phase. Next is an FM pair. So this, you can select a carrier and a modulator, kind of like a ring mod effect. After that is a multi-oscillator, which has detune built into it. As you can hear, the more I turn up the detune amount, the wider the effect gets. And finally, the last one is a noise oscillator, which is great. You have static and band, sample hold. I tend to use white noise to try to do these effects like this, turn some delay on and ride that filter up to get this electric wind kind of effect. Now, here I'm going to just add 3 different oscillators and then show you how the signal flow goes. So all 3 of those are sent to the mixer, pass through the filter, and then that goes down to the shaper, and that could either go straight to the amp, or it could also be sent into filter 2, or the signal can be split out from the mixer also down to filter 2 and be summed into the amp as well. So it depends on which signal routing you choose on those different arrows. I'm going to turn on all 3 of these oscillators and show you how the mixer works. And by the way, you can also sync those, which kind of aligns their waveform. And there's also the AM, amplitude modulation, which you can turn up a little bit. So down here on the mixer section, you have 2 sliders and a rotary knob. And then the rotary knob mixes the balance of 1 and 2. One fader just selects the volume of 1 and 2, and the other fader just selects the volume of 3. Now let's go over the filter types. So it starts with a low pass ladder filter. You can select keyboard tracking, different ranges, velocity. We'll turn up the resonance. Then there's a state variable filter, and then a comb filter, and lastly a formant filter, which has XY capabilities. Let's go over a little bit of the filter envelope. So the filter envelope and amp envelope work similar to what we've done on other devices. After that, it goes into the shaper. So let's go through a few different parameters in there. You have different kinds of distortion. Now let's turn on filter 2, and here I'll just select the third module, which is the noise oscillator going into the comb filter, and then it's being sent into the amp. Now on amp, you have the gain, which is a volume, and then you also have the pan, right and left. And then the velocity, depending on how sensitive you make the velocity. Now also, on this global section, you have delay, which you can turn on tempo sync, affect the modulation, the speed. And then you also have the chorus. LFO1, global envelope, and LFO2 are just controlled by the modulation bus. They have to be assigned down here. So let's look at the modulation bus. On the far left, it goes through source, amount, destination, amount, scale. And then on the right, you have source, amount, destination 1, amount, destination 2, amount, scale. And then below that is source, amount, destination, amount, scale 1, amount, scale 2. So we'll start out and click on this top slot and add LFO1. Now let's turn the amount knob up so that it affects it as much as it possibly can. And we'll select the destination of that to be amp gain. And we'll turn that all the way up as well. So let's go through the LFO. There's several different wave types. Obviously you can control the speed and tempo sync. Let's go through a few different waveforms. Below, on the second slot of the modulation bus, let's select LFO2, the amount 100%, destination, LFO1 rate, the amount 100%. So you can hear that the first LFO now is speeding up to the waveform of the LFO2. And now let's turn on the delay, and now we'll select in the third slot LFO2, 100% amount is affecting the delay time at 100% amount. Now let's assign those modifiers. So let's start out and choose rotary 1 and add a formant filter on the third filter slot, and we'll choose that at 100% to affect the frequency X of the third filter, filter 3, at 100%. Now let's go over the step sequencer. So the step sequencer works kind of like a matrix, just by default. We'll turn on run, turn it up to repeat mode, and choose some different notes here. Now let's go through it and affect the velocity a little bit. In order to make that work, let's turn the velocity down. Then gate length, let's make some of the notes a little bit sharper, shorter than the others. So with the curve, we're going to control filter frequency. So we have to assign filter curve on the source and then have the destination of that filter frequency and scale at 100%. Now if I move the amount all around, you can hear it has a really nice sounding effect. Well, that scale on the far right slot can be controlled. So in this case, I'm going to assign that rotary 1 to control the scale. Another trick that I like to do is to use the source as last key gate at 100%, and we'll record that as a sample trigger. So every time I press down, now it's going to start running. I press down on the keys and it becomes a performance-friendly instrument. Now I'll use the source as LFO 1 and have that LFO go to filter frequency 1, that amount 100. And now we'll go to the step sequencer and have that MIDI gate at 100% to the sample trigger. We'll turn that to 100%. And the third thing we'll do here is go to the curve of the step sequencer to control the LFO rate, and we'll turn that up to 100%. Now I can just assign this to 4 buttons here and move those knobs, change the sound a little bit. As you can see, every time that I hit the key on the keyboard, it triggers a different time subdivision that I can specify with that knob. Last thing we're going to do is process audio through the Thor. So I'm going to take those same drums and take the cable out of its mix channel and take the Octo-Rex cables into audio 1 and 2. If I hit run on it, you don't hear anything yet, but if I go down to the modulation bus and select source to be audio 1 on the first slot, audio 2 on the second slot, turn up to 100%, and then the destination of that to be filter 3, in left for the first slot and then in right for the next slot. Now let's add an LFO 2 to the third slot, turn it up 100%, and have that destination be filter 3X, and turn that up to 100%. Now I can kind of mess with the LFO to get the right tones. So that, as you can see, there's a whole world of possibilities in this.